Overcoming communality. Social selection. When a human being makes a choice in favor of one set of values or another, it is, for the most part, the so-called voice of blood that speaks within him rather than any objective or rational consideration. The principles by which the human psyche functions neither progress nor improve. They are immutable and primitive like the laws of physics. Can the law of universal gravitation be improved? It can only be utilized. Moral development is a fiction. The law, by punishing certain acts of will, in essence punishes people for their inborn qualities. This may seem unjust, however, there is a deeper meaning at work. The law or, more broadly, the state serves here as an instrument of selection within the human material. The purpose of such artificial selection is the cultivation and social predominance of a certain type of personality in accordance with a pre-established value system. Which tendency of selection, progressive or regressive, will prevail in a given society depends on the outcome of the struggle between the forces that uphold one or another set of life values as the conditions of their own existence. The establishment of a dominant value system within society is thus a question of victory or defeat among the corresponding social forces in their struggle for supremacy. The further selection of human material proceeds according to the criteria of the prevailing value system and social relations. The dominant type of human being within a society is determined by this process of selection within its population. Those individuals endowed with certain inborn traits are encouraged, while the reproduction of individuals with other traits is actively suppressed. Natural selection. One of the fundamental regularities upon which sociology relies is the principle of natural selection. Originally developed within the field of biology, this concept has also found application in the social sciences. Understanding the profound interconnection between natural selection and social variables provides researchers with a more integral vision of human behavior and social transformation. In this article, we shall analyze the key parameters of natural selection, their influence on social processes, and the methods employed to evaluate them within sociological research. We will seek to determine which elements influencing social structures may be compared to the natural mechanisms of selection, as well as what tools may be used for their study. Natural selection is a process through which organisms possessing more optimal characteristics for their environment enjoy greater chances of survival and reproduction. In the sociological context, we can consider not only biological but also social and cultural factors that affect the survival and development of social groups and communities. For instance, those social practices and norms that best correspond to the requirements of a particular historical or cultural context may become selected in the course of social change, thereby enhancing the cohesion and adaptability of the group in question. In sociology, one must also take into account social variations that may be analogous to biological differences within a population. These variations manifest in forms of behavior, social norms, and institutional structures, creating the conditions for complex interactions between individuals and their environments. For example, in cultures that encourage cooperation and mutual assistance, more cohesive communities may emerge, communities that are better equipped to confront collective challenges. Thus, the study of such social variations makes it possible to identify which values and orientations contribute to the adaptation and survival of groups under changing conditions. It is quite evident that every lineage and every nation possesses hereditary qualities unique to itself. Yet not all existing characteristics define a people, only the predominant ones. The traits that dominate within the human material of a nation determine its general character. The fate of that nation, its progress or decline, depends on which traits prevail. These qualities achieve predominance within society not through peaceful means but through the struggle for existence and the selection of those individuals most adapted to their natural and social environment. For at the foundation of all human behavior, under any circumstance, lies rational egoistic calculation rooted in the animal instinct of self-preservation. Man is an animal, and as such he brings into his intraspecies relations all the modes of interaction found in the animal world. The human being, in modern society no less than in primitive times, continues to be subject to the laws of species formation. Here we are speaking of various forms of natural selection: directional, stabilizing, sexual, and others. The struggle for existence, governed by the laws of natural selection, in conditions of human coexistence within an organized society, that is, under conditions of communal life, constitutes the very meaning of human social activity regardless of how artificially it may be regulated by norms. Within the limits set by social norms, there unfolds a perpetual and unceasing struggle for existence. Its laws form the underlying mechanism of everyday life. The natural consequence of this struggle is the continual manifestation of cruelty among people expressed in both psychological and physical violence. The struggle for dominance is the fundamental law of nature, the aim of which is the maximal adaptation of the species to its environment. In this struggle, the most adapted survive. Under conditions of communal existence, when the population of a given territory becomes sufficiently dense and numerous individuals enter into competition not with nature, but with one another for the preservation and improvement of their social position. It is here that we must emphasize, within such conditions, the human being no longer struggles against the forces of nature but against his fellow humans. Consequently, the individual most adapted not to the natural environment but to the communal one gains the upper hand. Thus, within communal conditions, the directional form of selection, which in the natural environment favored the carriers of extreme traits, is replaced by stabilizing selection, directed against those individuals who deviate markedly from the average norm and in favor of those with moderate expression of traits. In human society, adaptation to one's environment is therefore expressed as a tendency toward mediocrity and the elimination of all individuals whose characteristics exceed the general average. Main conclusion: the objective tendency of natural selection under communal conditions is a tendency toward predominantly negative selection toward mediocrity, homogeneity, simplification, and degeneration. Two aspects of existence. In the existence of every human being, every group of people, and society as a whole, two distinct aspects may be discerned: the business and the communal. The business aspect of society is regulated by the operation of economic laws that ensure the progressive character of social evolution, while the communal aspect is governed by laws that manifest themselves throughout the evolution of organic life. Every long-lived collective, in the business dimension of its activity, constitutes a system of productive relations, yet in its communal dimension, it forms a system of communal relations. These communal relations are determined by the inherent human need to establish communicative ties: cooperation, rivalry, leadership, subordination, interaction, recreation, and education under conditions of shared existence. While the business aspect of life is regulated by the particular laws of socio-economic development, the formation of society in its communal aspect is determined by the general laws of organic evolution, namely, the laws of natural selection and the struggle for existence. The laws of natural selection, when applied to the cohabitation of human beings, appear in the form of behavioral norms that regulate relations within the communal dimension of life. Man is a gregarious animal. He sustains his existence within the natural environment through cooperation with his own kind, and thus he lives in a herd, a commune, a collective. The communal or herd, collective, and mass mode of life is the human form of realizing the instinct of self-preservation in the course of the struggle for existence. Under Nietzsche's concept of the herd instinct, understood as the totality of rules of communal behavior followed by people in their everyday life, we are essentially dealing with the human instinct of self-preservation. The exchange of information, the division of labor, and mutual exploitation under conditions of cohabitation constitute the specific human method of struggle for survival in the surrounding environment. Any spontaneously formed communal group, for the sake of self-preservation, necessarily transforms into a hierarchical system and develops within itself special phenomena of communality that coordinate all units of the group relative to one another and to the group as a whole in relation to the external environment. In other words, they perform the function of authority and governance. The communal aspect of society, or, in other terms, communality, is thus formed through relations of coordination, adaptation and interaction, and subordination, domination and obedience, under conditions of shared existence. Within these conditions, individuals are compelled to limit one another's freedom of will, on the one hand, to create authorized bodies of governance by delegating to them a portion of their natural right to freedom, on the other, to devise means of self-defense against the arbitrariness of power. Behavioral norms, particularly the norms of criminal law, were invented by human beings as a means of protecting themselves from their own instinctual nature. The formation of a structured society out of a primitive horde was, in essence, a process of restraining man's animal egocentrism. The emergence of social determinants of behavior was thus inseparable from the suppression of instinctual ones, the natural determinants of conduct. Social competition. The driving force behind the laws of communality lies in the instinctive human drive for self-preservation, for maximal adaptation to the surrounding environment, and for the improvement of one's conditions of existence. In his actions, man is guided first and foremost by the principle of personal interest, or benefit, or, to phrase it differently, by the principle of rational egoism, the principle of calculated self-interest. This principle of rational egoism is the fundamental law of social life. All other regularities of human existence are its particular expressions and are derived from the foundational principle of rational calculation. In accordance with this principle, a person does not act to his own detriment, he avoids the deterioration of his conditions of existence and prefers the better over the worse. Most human actions are determined by this striving. In pursuit of comfort and personal safety, people seek to occupy the most advantageous position within their social environment. The level of comfort and security of an individual is determined by his position within the social hierarchy, by the degree of his adaptation to the social environment, and the extent of his protection from communal competition. This, in turn, defines his attractiveness as an object of others' preferences. Hence, people seek comfort and security by every possible means, and it becomes necessary to restrict this pursuit through coercive behavioral norms. The norms of human behavior, law, and the organization of normative control, statehood, emerged as phenomena of primitive herdness, that is, communality, for the purpose of limiting the spontaneous forces of natural selection. Both the state and the law contain within themselves not only socio-economic but also deeper ethno-communal dimensions. In the course of socio-economic development, communal relations did not disappear, they merely receded to the background of social life, yielding priority to the business aspect. Yet the communal relations of coordination and subordination are still shaped by the conditions of place, climate and geography, and time, the stage of ethnic and civilizational development. These relations form the foundation of the entire structure of social relations and are governed by the laws of natural selection. When manifested within conditions of human coexistence, the laws of natural selection appear in the guise of social rules to which human life is subordinated in its communal aspect. The rules of communality are largely instinctive in nature, concealed beneath the disorienting camouflage of false or conventional behavior, and therefore are not consciously recognized on the level of objective knowledge. An individual learns them independently through personal adaptation to his communal environment. The set of laws governing communal relations forms a kind of herd instinct, deeply rooted in the psyche of most people. As such, the laws of communality are continuously reproduced in the course of social life. The laws of communality. Communal relations are expressed through the interaction of the individual with the group, the relations among individuals within the group, and the relations between groups of individuals. These relations are governed by the following fundamental laws of communality. 1. The law of subordination, the differentiation of individuals according to leadership and obedience, and 2. The law of coordination, the mutual competition and adaptive adjustment of individuals. The law of subordination. Every group strives to exercise total control over each individual who belongs to it. Conversely, each individual seeks to weaken his dependence upon the group as much as possible and to increase the group's dependence upon him. The degree of an individual's dependence on the group tends to increase, while the degree of his independence from the group tends to diminish. The individual's independence is directly proportional to the position he occupies within the internal hierarchy of the group. Intragroup relations of power divide into those of subordination, leadership and obedience, and coordination, competition and mutual adjustment. Leadership within a group expresses the interests of the group as a unified communal organism. It constitutes the official form of recognition of spontaneous communality and represents the concentrated product of its laws in action. The rules by which people rise to positions of leadership and act within the sphere of authority are developed by society itself as the cumulative result of human behavior governed by the laws of communality. Relations of subordination, leadership and obedience, are regulated by the rule that the leader, by virtue of the basic law of herd behavior rational calculation seeks personal independence from the collective will of the group while striving to render the group maximally dependent upon himself. The leader therefore seeks to concentrate in his own hands the fullness of power over the group entrusted to him by eliminating potential competitors among its members. Consequently, a leader cares about the interests of his subordinates and of the common cause only to the extent that such concern contributes to the preservation and consolidation of his own power. The group, in turn, by virtue of the law of coordination, the mutual competition and adaptation of individuals seeks to restrain the growing influence of the leader and to subordinate his activity to its collective interests. 2. The law of coordination. Intragroup relations of coordination are governed by the rule of mutual obstruction. This rule manifests itself in the individual's inclination to weaken the social position of his competitors to prevent their advancement, or, if prevention is impossible, to minimize it as much as possible. A competitor, for any individual, is another person who surpasses him in significance in the eyes of others. In such cases, the individual typically exerts every possible effort to undermine the competitor's position, inflicting upon him the greatest possible harm. The tendency to reduce any outstanding phenomenon to the level of one's own mediocrity is the natural policy of the majority under conditions of shared existence and instinctive adaptation strategy. Murder, violence, insult, slander, betrayal, denunciation, intrigue, envy, all these are not exceptions but rather routine and lawful expressions of coordination relations under conditions of communality. The interaction of the principles of subordination and coordination thus produces a tendency toward the convergence of the spontaneous and official aspects of communality, resulting in the general leveling, averaging, of the group's intellectual potential, the narrowing of its possibilities for evolutionary growth, and its consequent social degradation. Communal life. The goal of communal existence for each individual is to achieve the maximum possible level of consumption through competitive struggle for the most advantageous social position while expending the least possible effort. An individual who fails, over the course of his communal life, to master the rules of communal behavior is condemned to continual conflict with his social environment and to defeat in the struggle for existence. In human society, what is truly valued is not a person's business or moral qualities, but rather his adaptation to the communal environment. All other attributes are secondary and unnecessary for maintaining viability under the routine conditions of communality. Individuals possessing anti-communal traits play leading social roles only in extreme circumstances, moments when the task of ensuring collective security requires exceptional abilities and the temporary suspension of the laws of communality. In such cases, the policy of the communal majority toward anti-communal individuals consists in exploiting their abilities for its own benefit, all the while concealing this exploitation under the camouflage of moral values. Conversely, during stable periods of inertial decline, society expels anti-communal individuals whose actions transcend the accepted communal norms of behavior. Under such conditions, those considered least deviant by communal standards occupy the dominant positions. The social process of communal life thus takes on the character of selection, the filtering of the human material of society and the elimination of individuals who fail to meet the prevailing criteria of selection. Within the communal sphere, this process assumes the form of behind-the-scenes conspiracies and collective reprisals against competitors. And since natural selection always serves the purpose of adapting a species to its environment, the struggle for existence within communality becomes a factor that prevents the formation of new forms. In the struggle for existence, it is the most adapted who prevail. Under communal conditions, the individual best adapted is the average one, the mediocrity. The results of natural selection under conditions of communality speak for themselves. Rare and outstanding individuals, when confronted by the multitude of the ordinary united by a shared instinct for self-preservation and the social dominance of their type, almost invariably suffer defeat. The more primitive the person, the closer he remains to his animal nature, and thus, within communal conditions, he acts according to its laws, the laws of natural selection. This explains why, in society, those who are most successful are usually the most amoral and primitive. The recipe for success under communality is simple: become an animal. Preconditions of communism. The first condition for the emergence of a communist society is the abolition of private property and private enterprise within the business aspect of life, accompanied by the transition to centralized economic management and, as a direct consequence, the expansion of the sphere of state power to its utmost possible limits. Under such circumstances, the communal aspect of social evolution begins to dominate over the business aspect. A communist society thus arises through the hypertrophic growth of those phenomena that, in any society, constitute the sphere of communality. Among these phenomena are the armed forces, law enforcement agencies, state institutions, labor unions, political parties, religious organizations, and other social associations. Real, historically realized communism represents an example of what occurs when this sphere of state power, normative regulation, public security, and social provision expands to engulf society in its entirety, subordinating all social relations to its influence. In the case of Russia, the objective precondition for the rise of a communist society was the World War and the growing role of the military communal organization, which extended the relations of consumptive communism to the whole of society. When implementing their plan for seizing power, the communists took advantage of the existing distribution of social forces, above all, of the excessive growth of the bureaucratic apparatus of state administration. Thus, as a result of the Bolshevik coup of 1917, Russia witnessed the emergence of a military communist organization of society, whose fundamental mode of existence became centralized, standardized production and consumption. Realized communism. The degree of material enrichment does not, by itself, determine an individual's position within the hierarchy of Sovietism. The principal value for the individual in such a system is not ownership of the means of production, but rather the social position he occupies and the opportunities for personal enrichment associated with it. Thus, real communism does not abolish social inequality arising from property relations, it merely replaces it with inequality rooted in relations of power. Realized communism is a system of labor collectives linked not only by relations of coordination but also by those of leadership and subordination. As a result, it becomes differentiated by a system of power privileges, structured around the distribution of material goods according to the principle of subordination. Therefore, under communism, it is not property and economics but power and politics that become the principal objects and arenas of private enterprise. If one leaves aside extreme, force majeure situations, the ordinary life of Soviet labor collectives can be described as a struggle of petty ambitions for power and social privilege, a struggle whose basic mechanism consists of a continuous sequence of behind-the-scenes intrigues and collective reprisals against competitors. Because the dynamics of social competition in its communal aspect are, by the law of entropy, determined by the principles of negative selection, the process of material stratification under Sovietism is likewise founded upon the relations of communality, relations that have nothing in common with a fair distribution of goods based on the realization and recognition of individual merit. In the conditions of Sovietism, the principal means of acquiring benefits, profit, becomes mimicry, opportunism, and maximal adaptation to the herd environment and its operational principles, that is, careerism. Consequently, not the demonstration of competence or productive effectiveness, but rather the number and quality of one's communal connections serve as the chief means of advancement up the social ladder. The basis of human life in a real communist society is therefore the competitive struggle for power, that is, for access to privileges and the most advantageous social positions. The arena of social selection, social competition, and entrepreneurial activity thus shifts from the economy to the administrative hierarchy and the sphere of public authority to the very heart of communality. The fundamental relations of communist society are relations of communal competition. Under capitalism, this natural communal competition among individuals is openly acknowledged, restricted by the laws of the business aspect, and regulated through legal norms. Under communism, however, this process of natural competition takes on a hidden, unconscious, and spontaneous character and thus becomes all the more destructive. Communism is, in essence, embodied communality in its pure form, liberated from all constraints imposed by the business aspect. Communal competition, when unrestrained by external forces such as legal norms or practical efficiency, inevitably produces a stable tendency toward irresponsibility, wastefulness, impersonality, coercive egalitarianism, and the elimination of all genetically gifted and outstanding individuals who rise above the general level of mediocrity. In the end, it leads to the expansion of criminality, the total lumpinization of society, and the degeneration of the national gene pool. Real communism Sovietism thus replaces one form of objective social inequality and exploitation with another. By abolishing private ownership of the means of production and guaranteeing the equal satisfaction of basic human needs, communism merely transfers competition from the economic sphere into the sphere of mutual struggle for privileges within the hierarchy of the communist order. Real, that is, practically realized communism, proves incapable of suppressing the fundamental evolutionary force of humanity, the struggle for existence and its attendant laws. It merely restricts their operation within the business aspect of life while intensifying the struggle for existence within the communal, or herd, dimension. The Soviet crisis, characterized by an inexplicable proliferation of emergencies and systemic failures in all spheres of life, was the direct manifestation of these objective regularities that shaped the evolution of Soviet society. The essence of the communist crisis lies in the following. The business aspect of society recedes to the background, while the communal aspect assumes dominance. Competition among individuals thereby loses its economic character and reappears in its primordial form as a struggle for existence, for power, and for social privilege. 2. The objective laws of communism. The laws of communality, the laws of natural selection, at the peak of communist evolution acquire all-encompassing significance and begin to determine the functioning of the entire social organism, including those institutions of public and state authority that were meant to regulate them. 3. The dominance of the laws of communality leads to the prevalence of negative selection in society's human material, to the disintegration of its class structure, and to the lumpinization of the population. The social system becomes simplified and disorganized. As the emancipated laws of communality spread upward from the lower strata, the process of disorganization reaches the governing centers, resulting first in the paralysis of state administration and ultimately in the paralysis of social life itself. The fundamental problem of communism, the problem of communality, proved insoluble within the Soviet system. The paths toward overcoming the crisis of communality lay outside its limits. This crisis was fatal for Soviet society because its social system lacked the means for overcoming it, due to the very objective laws governing that system's functioning. The Soviet social crisis thus arose from the same regularities that determine communal relations, which dominate under real communism. The sphere of public and state authority, the sphere of communality itself, is the concentrated product of these laws. Hence, at the core of the communist crisis, the crisis of communality, lies the crisis of power, the crisis of governance, or, more precisely, the crisis of statehood. This crisis of communality also produced a crisis of the official ideology of power, spreading among the population an attitude of anti-state nihilism that corroded the very sphere of Soviet public consciousness. Unlike the capitalist crisis, which is economic in nature, the communist crisis is fundamentally a crisis of communality. It manifests as the progressive lumpinization of the masses, the disorganization of all spheres of life, including the economy, and, above all, as the disintegration of the spheres of state power and social consciousness. Anthropological catastrophe. The system of social guarantees ensuring equal consumption granted regardless of the productive activity of individuals and the widely advertised carefree mentality of the Soviet citizen, his so-called confidence in tomorrow, had the most destructive consequences for the evolution of mass consciousness in the USSR. The distribution of material goods disconnected from the sphere of production generated among broad strata of the Soviet population a lifestyle marked by infantilism, complacency, and negligence combined, paradoxically, with predatory opportunism and dependency. The main objective of many workers became unjustified enrichment through the criminal exploitation of state resources, public funds, and means of production for personal gain. The fulfillment of professional duties lost its intrinsic meaning, degenerating into a mere imitation, an act of theatrical performance serving as a means for the individual to appear better than he truly was. The widespread theft, parasitism, and simulated labor activity, the decline in productivity and professional competence observable in all spheres of Soviet organization and above all, in the sphere of governance were direct results of the objective laws inherent to the Soviet social order. Within the sphere of official authority, Soviet power had, in fact, institutionalized the laws of communality, laws according to which society continued to function to this day. Under the conditions of pure communality, the decisive factor for social advancement was no longer professional ability but the individual's readiness to act according to the principle of rational self-interest, to seize as much as possible from his position with minimal effort, without regard for long-term consequences. A well-developed communal instinct is not a sign of professional aptitude but rather of mediocrity, which instinctively compensates for the lack of innate ability in the social struggle for survival. Under the dominance of communality, the most successful careerist is not the competent or talented worker but the adaptable conformist, one unburdened by moral constraints. In other words, the most likely path to success in such a society belongs to the sociable opportunist. Individuals of mediocre ability and low professional competence, expelled from the productive sphere, found in the party and state bureaucracy a perfect environment to exercise their communal skills. Through this process of negative selection, the upper strata of Soviet leadership became a reservoir of societal refuse and accumulation of degenerative human material that posed a direct threat to the state's survival. At first, in the interest of self-preservation, the communist regime not only exploited but also, to some degree, cultivated pockets of personal creativity within the Russian populace. Yet in the post-war era of global peace, the egalitarian mechanisms of communism began to function at full strength. The entire late Soviet period became one of inertial decline and slow negative selection, a phase that began with the destruction of the nation's evolutionary elite during the Red Terror. This era of gradual decay may appear, in retrospect, as one of creative vitality only by contrast with the present condition of the Russian Federation. But in reality, the RF anti-Soviet in form yet Soviet in essence is the logical outcome of the degeneration of the Soviet system. We continue to live within the remnants of that system, in an advanced state of disintegration. One of the chief agents of this collapse was the communoidal human material generated by life under Soviet conditions. Seeking to fortify the stability of the Soviet regime through the degeneration and lumpinization of its population, the bureaucratic party apparatus inadvertently bred, in the figure of the Soviet man, the gravedigger of its own order. The state's all-encompassing paternalism, equal remuneration regardless of effort, and minimal demands on productivity did not promote intellectual or moral development. Instead, they nurtured a self-satisfied petty bourgeois mentality steeped in theft, corruption, and cynicism. Embezzlement reached colossal proportions, undermining the economic foundations of Soviet society. The economy lost all efficiency and lapsed into paralysis. Confronted with crisis, society sought a way out, only to encounter a new obstacle: intellectual degeneration, not only among the ruling elite but throughout the general population. The crisis of public consciousness expressed in the degeneration of the national gene pool and the general stupefaction of society developed according to the objective laws of Soviet social functioning, the laws of communality. The dominance of mediocrity, universal incompetence, class disintegration, total lumpinization, decline of initiative, and stagnation of scientific and technological progress were the inevitable consequences of the absolute triumph of herd principles in social life. A social system in which the principles of the business aspect yield to the laws of communality inevitably produces, within its consciousness, doctrinal thinking, a mentality in which misinformation and false behavior become the routine form of communication. The tendency toward total disinformation, simulated activity, intellectual decline, incompetence, and universal unfitness revealed itself in the alarming growth of crises, accidents, and emergencies in all spheres of Soviet life and above all, in the sphere where the entire process of communal existence was concentrated, state administration. The official criteria of social selection were such that the ruling and privileged strata came to be filled with individuals whose personal and professional qualities were wholly inadequate to their positions. Under the dominance of negative selection, a rise in rank corresponded to a decline in competence to a lowering of intellectual, cultural, moral, and professional standards. It is therefore unsurprising that, during the period of crisis, the apparatus of state power became saturated with incompetent opportunists. Guided solely by the principle of self-interest, the brainwashed populace and its leaders alike lost the capacity to assess their own destructive actions or to foresee their catastrophic consequences. The struggle for existence and the struggle for prestige. The struggle for existence acquires a truly positive character only under conditions of dispersed habitation, for in such conditions it favors the predominance of individuals bearing extreme traits and contributes to the accumulation of useful genetic qualities within the human material, thereby stimulating ethnic development. Once a population reaches a certain demographic density, however, natural selection reverses its direction, it becomes a negative, simplifying, and stabilizing factor of evolution and, when left unchecked, a force of social and biological degeneration. The domination of communal principles within the sphere of sexual selection and preference inevitably leads to the reproduction and numerical growth of mediocrities within the population. The prevailing system of natural selection eliminates all carriers of extreme characteristics that transcend the average type, thereby simplifying the structure of human association and driving the process along a regressive trajectory. This selective mechanism assumes various forms in different social contexts, yet its regressive direction remains constant. Only the emergence and ascendancy of productive relations over communal ones has allowed human society to break free from the tyranny of natural selection and to transform the primitive community into a civilization capable of non-biological progress. Within the process of business selection, productive collectives emerge and evolve, organizing themselves into professional corporations that together constitute the technostructure of society. Through culture, understood as organized technique, humanity has conquered and transformed not only the surrounding world but also itself. Culture has become a constant and dominant factor of human biological evolution, a self-sustaining source of progressive development that ensures the preservation and renewal of civilization's creative potential. Unlike the animal species, for which instinct serves as the guarantee of survival, the human species relies on culture, which is founded upon the struggle for pure prestige rather than mere survival. It is this struggle that has become the sole guarantor of humanity's preservation and advancement. As part of nature, man remains subject to the spontaneous operation of natural selection. Ethnic groups emerge and develop under conditions of low population density, when natural selection promotes the improvement of the population's qualitative traits. But as the population grows, internal selection begins to cull its most capable representatives. In densely populated conditions, natural selection causes a decline in ethnogenesis, a simplification of ethnic structure, and the waning of evolutionary dynamism. Ethnic formation, being subject to the laws of speciation, in communal conditions takes the form of negative selection, which drives the ethnic system towards simplification, stabilization, and eventual disintegration. The unrestricted rule of communal laws, the laws of speciation, diminishes a population's resistance to external natural and social pressures and thus dooms it, sooner or later, to extinction. During the ascending phase of ethnogenesis, society is animated by a multitude that struggles not for existence but for personal dignity and pure prestige. This anti-communal multitude gives birth to social culture, the very medium through which humanity as a species achieves progress. The members of the anti-communal multitude are characterized by their orientation beyond the satisfaction of natural needs, by their critical attitude toward the established order, and by their desire at any cost to transform the inertial state of the social environment. The rise or decline of any human collective depends on the degree to which this anti-communal multitude, those engaged in the struggle for pure prestige, affects its life activity and sustains the necessary level of civilizational development. The striving for personal freedom, the individual's will to liberate himself from the bonds of communality, serves to counteract the spontaneous tendency toward uniformity embedded in every collective. Embodied in the figure of the genius, this personal uniqueness becomes the justification of the species, the nation, or the class to which the individual belongs before the tribunal of nature. Thus there arises a world distinct from that of nature, the world of history. Conclusion. Understanding the full set of variables described above, in their mutual interaction and correlation, enables psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, administrators, and other specialists to analyze human behavior both individual and collective on a deeper level. Moreover, such understanding allows for the development of strategies for its correction or reinforcement, particularly through the use of artificial intelligence and related analytical tools. Grasping the mechanisms of social selection and the biological variables that influence social groups may yield substantial advantages in the fields of social policy and governance. For instance, such knowledge can inform the design of programs aimed at strengthening social cohesion and sustaining group identity, tasks that have become especially urgent under conditions of globalization and large-scale migration. Social programs that take into account the specific cultural and historical contexts of their target populations can significantly increase their effectiveness. Furthermore, a comprehensive understanding of the mechanics of social selection can assist in addressing issues of social justice and equality. By identifying the factors that shape the distribution of resources and opportunities within society, one can determine which groups occupy vulnerable positions and develop targeted measures to support them. The application of the principles of inclusive growth and social equity thus becomes particularly relevant in times of economic crisis, when many population groups face new existential challenges. The future of sociological research in the domain of social selection and its variables promises to be multifaceted and complex. With the advent of technologies such as big data and artificial intelligence, sociologists and policymakers who employ the method of variable analysis in social selection will gain new instruments for data collection and analysis, tools capable of revealing intricate correlations among social factors at a deeper structural level. Future studies may focus on the interplay between digital technologies and social change, as well as on how modern channels of communication influence social practices and identities. In this way, the comprehension of selectional dynamics, natural, social, and cultural alike, will continue to evolve, offering new means to understand and shape the development of human civilization.